Hello everyone, the following video will be a discussion of Mind, Path to Thalamus, created and published by Carlos Coronado onto Steam on the 6th of August 2014. The game is a first-person puzzle game that puts the player in the shoes of a weather scientist, reminiscing on his life as he lies in a hospital bed in a coma. The game is a refinement of another of Coronado's projects called Coma, which deals with similar ideas and themes. Mind states that it is a mind-bending tale, in which the player will have to bend the weather itself in order to solve puzzles and progress. It goes without saying that this video contains spoilers for the game's puzzles, its plot, as well as its ending, so if you have any plans to play the game, I thoroughly recommend that you stop the video and grab it on Steam. It's only a 4-hour deal, but you'll get a lot out of it for having played it. I'll begin with a general discussion and then focus on the game intimately. Thanks for stopping by, and I hope you enjoy what you hear. Before we take a look at Mind intimately, I think it's important to talk about its context and some of its influences. Some comparisons to the game have called it a more complete Dear Esther, and I think this is kind of true. When it first released in 2012, Dear Esther was a controversial game. It was presented as an experiment, a development of a previous Half-Life mod that was brought up to marketable levels with professional voice acting and a better set of graphics and effects. The game was widely discussed at the time. People had no idea if it could be really called a game at all. The only thing you had to do was walk forward and listen to the narration when it came. The game was, at the same time, praised for delivering an engaging atmosphere through the island and in reinforcing it by genuinely trying to create unhappiness in the player. The developers wanted something to rush in and fill the gap drawn by the bleak landscape, the stark narration, and the simplistic systems. Just what that was up to the player. The game itself was about a man reminiscing over his dead wife, and the player could draw their own conclusions in addition to that. The only real incentives to move forward were to hear more narration, see more sights, and maybe get a sense of closure. It was an interesting idea, a unique game moved along by audiovisual cues and feedback that did an interesting job of pacing its story with exploration in spite of its stilted narration and purple prose. It was a game about loneliness and regret. A lonely man climbing a tower to die on a lonely island. Yet in spite of this nihilistic premise, the game was largely panned on Steam. It's even tagged as a walking simulator if you go on the store page. It was, however, still important in its attempt to be artful and introspective. It opened the door a little for other developers to experiment or to be experimental with their work, to try different means of storytelling and to use interactivity in new and unique ways, even subtractive ways, to convey information to the player and to move the story along. Dear Esther has since been compared to games like Journey, To the Moon, Gone Home, and even horror games, but it's only now that this style of games has been evolved by addition. Mind, Path to Thalamus is the evolution of the design concepts introduced in Dear Esther. Like Dear Esther, the story is about a man engaged in thought, but unlike Dear Esther, the settings are markedly different. Dear Esther was set on a bleak island. Mind is literally set in the protagonist's mind. The landscapes are dreamscapes, and there are neurological and psychological metaphors baked into the levels and some proper use of symbols throughout as well. While Dear Esther made the player walk forward, Mind makes the player take a step back and think. It's not linear like Dear Esther because it's paced and split into puzzles which play back into the theme of reflection. Mind challenges the player's mind intimately, to think spatially, to time moves appropriately, to experiment and to explore. Unfortunately, just like Dear Esther, Mind suffers, in at least the release version, from the same overt, stilted narration that characterized Dear Esther as a pretentious, purple, angsty mess. This has since been addressed in a recent patch, and the developer has said that they plan to overhaul the script a little bit, which is really nice, but it doesn't change the fact that the critical first version of the game featured narration like this.
Quote myself, "It is at night that we value the sun. Light and darkness are absolutes. Absolutes are easy, and easy is boring, but mix them up, and you will find my fascination follows suit. Countless unforeseen consequences. If we could see the inner workings of this infinity, we would mimic the deer that stands still to elude its predator. Need opposites to explain away complex realities. Can you blame them? Such powerful symbols."
Mind, Path to Thalamus is about that man. He's in a coma. He was caught in the path of a tornado or a waterspout while trying to ensure his daughter's safety, and he suffers a brain injury which puts him into that coma. The game proper is concerned with him walking through parts of his mind, his memories, and surreal landscapes which act as a prompt for reflection and navel-gazing on the scientist's part. It's kind of like 5 people you meet in heaven crossed with mist. The landscapes contain puzzles which must be passed so that you can progress on your journey to Thalamus, a giant tree on the horizon whose role in the narrative is revealed as you go along, both by the narrator's voiceover and through the mechanics of the game itself. I think it needs to be said at the outset that the voiceover in this game is its biggest drawback. It spoon-feeds the player more plot and story than needs to be told. Also, there's a lot of purple prose that's thrown around, and sometimes it feels like it was written by an angsty teenager than a scientist who's thinking about the deaths of his sister and maybe even his own daughter. From a design perspective, the inclusion of voice acting makes sense. If the story wasn't presented in some way to the player, then the player would have to spend time searching the landscape for story clues or spending time reading into the game's mechanics themselves. This would disrupt the pacing of the puzzles and the rhythm of the game to the point that stages might not end properly or puzzles might get stretched out and spread too thinly. Games like Myst and Dear Esther didn't have this problem because they were largely linear and tied the plot of the game to the progress of the player, so the two played off of each other quite nicely. Mind isn't linear, not in the long term. It presents its puzzles in discrete stages so that it can pace itself and its systems in an easy-to-access format, and so that it can scale its challenge bit by bit along with the narrative. The first few of Mind's puzzles are easy to access and quite playful. They explain core ideas like controlling the weather, platforming, and switches. Later puzzles are quite tough, and I mean tough, and you might spend a lot of time sitting on just one of them and trying to make them budge, though the climb from easy to hard isn't felt that much because the game really nails its pacing in spite of its short length. Now it is short, only about 4 hours long when you first run through, but it's very worth it. Even though the voice acting is a little bit on the poor side, the game has a really strong message, and it's capably told through its puzzles, its mechanics, and of course the staggeringly beautiful landscapes. On that note, I should talk about the puzzles themselves, the meat and potatoes of the game. The puzzles in Mind are tied very closely to its story, and the game really deserves some praise for that. You'll walk along neurons, carry little balls shaped like nerve clusters, reverse the course of night and day, play with rain and fog, and even control time as you move throughout the game's puzzles and see things grow and evolve. There are even a few proper boss battles towards the end which back up story points and actually make sense given the context. The puzzles in this game also resonate with the story. You're a weather scientist, so the bulk of the mechanics come down to manipulating the weather and the world in some way. Like I said, the first few puzzles serve as a literal introduction to the game. You get knocked out by a tornado, or a waterspout or a cyclone, I'm still not really sure, and then you have to navigate a surreal landscape of salt flats and red weeds, like it was taken straight out of War of the Worlds. It's here that the first metaphor for reflection gets translated into game mechanics. You need to use mirrors to reflect light, because mirrors reflect. I mean, it doesn't get any simpler than that. Some of the ideas in the game are really smart, and some are less so, like the mirrors. Other systems, like the night and day mechanic, for example, are very intuitive. With this system, if you stand in the right place for the right amount of time, you can make everything turn into nighttime. This is useful in a number of ways. You can use teleporting doors at night to get across gaps, and at nighttime you can use special glowing nerve clusters to use other switches or panels. These special switches also disappear when night turns to day, so you can set up Rube Goldberg cascades of switches and interactions to turn things on and off and to get through stages in a timely manner. That's the point of the game, really. The game's all about using your head to progress. The game's even called Mind. I mean, it doesn't get simpler than that. The 20-something puzzles form the core of the game's capital M message, that sometimes you have to use your head, and often it's all you'll have to get through tough times, and it's really hard to confront core and uncomfortable truths about ourselves, especially those that run to the core of who we are as people. This kind of progression and storytelling is smartly reinforced by the game's reward system as well. Whenever you do something smart or move forward a little bit, you'll get a snippet of dialogue, music, or some kind of feedback, and in spite of the narrator's tone and flatness, there's some real incentive to move forward and see what's through the next doorway. It's this kind of positive player feedback that's important in a game like this. With so few variations on the same mechanics, it's easy to get burned out despite all of the pretty graphics inside. It's also important because the puzzles drive the narrative. Every time you pass a puzzle, you get closer to the ultimate truth, the thalamus, and the core of your story. The story itself is some pretty engrossing subject matter told through some easily accessible metaphors. You're a weather scientist chasing storms. You get caught in a tornado or a cyclone or a waterspout. If somebody could clear that up, I'd be really happy. While you're trying to keep your daughters safe. You get a massive concussion, you wind up in a coma. The overarching story of the game takes place in this coma, like we've already said, and it's introspective. By passing puzzles, you get closer to the thalamus, the part of the brain that regulates consciousness and orders all the sensory information picked up by the body. The thalamus is represented as a giant tree in this game, and it's through this kind of ham-fisted illusion and other clunky relationships that the plot starts being fleshed out. Now, bear with me because this is convoluted as all hell. The story starts with your father, who is also a weather scientist. You were with him on a field trip when a tsunami threatened the lives of you and your sister Sophia. You survived because you climbed a tree, so there's that illusion in the bag. Sophia didn't survive. Now you're a weather scientist, and your daughter is also named Sophia. Let's recap. Your father was a weather scientist, and so were you. Your sister Sophia died, and so that's what you named your daughter. You'd be forgiven for thinking you're reading a Bronte novel, and all of this tangled stuff is given via a running narration which delivers bits of the story in the same stilted, arrogant tone of voice that really doesn't add much to the game as a whole, so now it's Wuthering Heights meets Dear Esther. It tells the story of a man driven to grief by terror and loss, but it's also told by the most self-absorbed, egotistical shitheel imaginable. I mean, just take a listen to some of this stuff.
A single beam of light shone through the dense mist. When something like that happens, what are you supposed to do but follow it? It was textbook storytelling, really. But honest truths tend to sound like that. To quote myself, we wouldn't dare make a move. I couldn't see it, so I followed the path. Well, I guess I am a chip off the old stupid fucking block.
People have even decided to mess with the localization and audio files to get rid of the talking entirely, and the problem is so massive that the developer themselves have said that they're going to cut out most of the dialogue and rewrite it, and I have to say it makes sense in that way because the game tells its story so much better through its systems and its world. Each of the systems in the game has a mechanical and graphical representation, and all of them tell the story in a simple and accessible manner through developing metaphors and deeper interpretations of things, especially when we consider that this game is themed around psychological processes and elements of memory, recall, and thought processing. For example, the little balls of nerves that you can pick up and carry around represent thoughts and ideas. When you move them around and use them to interact with the environment, you're moving thoughts and ideas and interacting with concepts to change your understanding of the situation as a whole, represented as the field of vision when you look around. Now, that's just one way of looking at it. Let's take a step back and consider this from another angle. Let's talk about fog. Fog can obscure your view of the terrain, and it's triggered by moving a little ball of nerves into this confluence of trees. If you take the ball out of the trees, the fog collects into a solid mass that blocks movement. In the same way, it's difficult to develop ideas if we're blocked by a preconception, but if we overcome that preconception, then it makes it more difficult to find our way through new ideas and this kind of murky uncertainty. It also plays nicely into the idea of expressing psychological processes through natural metaphors. How often have we said that our minds are clouded, our memory is foggy, or that our pain is electric in character? The nighttime metaphor from earlier is another system with some depth. Changing the setting from day to night is less about changing individual ideas than changing perspectives entirely. Transitioning from day to night changes the color palette of the entire field of play, as well as enabling mechanics like the teleporting doors and the glowing nerve balls. In this way, changing perspective not only changes how we see things immediately in front of us, but opens new options and avenues of thought. This is a nice allegory for overcoming set ideas to progress, both in life and maturity, and I know I'm gonna catch hell for slapping high school English onto a video game, but it just goes to show two things. Firstly, there's a lot of depth to this game if you're willing to look for it, and second, the game's perfectly capable of telling its story without the stilted narration or by feeding me ideas and platitudes. You'll find your own conclusions if you apply your own readings to this game, so have a playthrough and see what you find. The design of the puzzles, the visual language, and the systems of the game all serve to tell its story and tell it in a deeper way than simple words ever could. It's an impressive feat of game design that the puzzles, their constituent parts, and their evolutions all contribute to the game's greater ideas by contributing their own discrete units of meaning. It's also important to remember that because we're inside the protagonist's head, everything we're seeing is a construction of his subconscious. The salt flats, the classical architecture, the caves, plains, forest, and the tree itself are all psychological imagery which I have no idea how to interpret. I'm sorry, that's not my field, so I'm not even going to play ball. But it still goes to show that there's a lot more to this game than meets the eye. This is even more relevant because the story itself is about time, regret, and what happens when we allow our memories to change and mutate and even start to dominate us. The story proper in terms of its narrative is pretty convoluted. You're trying to get to the tree because the tree is the source of your regret over leaving your sister Sophia. It's also the allegory for heaven in this game. You make it there only to realize that you've been deluding yourself about things from the get-go. The game even lampshades this by saying you named your daughter after your dead sister. That's how to mess up your kid 101. It's a trite way of looking at how our memories change and alter as time goes on. Sometimes traumatic incidences in our past get built up by reinforcement and we can make things out to be much worse than they actually were. This certainly doesn't mean that pain is invalid at all, it just means that sometimes our memories play tricks on us. Mine shows this through deft writing and a few nice plot twists and honest character development over the course of the game. It's very sincere that the protagonist realizes that he caused his father pain by asking about the death of his sister, and the final boss drives this home. In obsessing over the death of his sister, the protagonist has built his life around her death, but not her as a person. He's turned her into a concept that's touched on using the rose and lily motifs in the game. All of his life, becoming a weather scientist, naming his daughter Sophia as well, were all expressions of this, and when the player realizes it, it's a really smart moment for the game and an effective twist in the story at a really powerful climax, probably one of the points in the game where narration is appropriate. It's a shame then that the boss's dialogue is just as stilted and really just as bad as our narrator, which is okay, seeing as the boss is him, basically. It's also true to life and relatable as well. How many times have we made mountains out of molehills in our lives and our childhoods? Are things really as bad as they seem? Are we happy to live with clear horizons that might be wrong, or do we have the courage to take a step through the fog and see what's on the other side? These are questions that the scientist answers himself. After the player beats the final boss, he wakes from a 10-years-long coma and goes to find his daughter. His daughter is making the same mistakes he made, chasing her own storms and living her own life as a second-hand product of her father's regret. It's on this note that the game ends, with the scientist taking a road trip to see his daughter Sophia and talk to her. This is awesome because it's character development, actual tangible character development that's occurred in a real arc across the game. It means so much because all of those puzzles, all of that thinking actually meant something to the character and to the player. All the navel-gazing had a positive result, and that's good because it provides a real sense of closure. There's no sequel hook, no twist ending. There's just a man who's had to think about his life and who wants to stop his daughter from making the same mistakes that he did. In that way, he's cleared his own horizons and come to terms with the paths ahead of him. And as an ending, you can't get any better than that. I've said that Mind is an evolution of the concepts introduced in Dear Esther, but to leave it at that would be wrong. This is its own game, with its own idea, its own message, and its own way of doing things, all of which work really well. The reason I compared it to Dear Esther is that Mind, Path to Thalamus is a step in the right direction for this new genre of games that try to get the player to think. Granted, that does sound a little pretentious, but I think it's an achievable idea. Games, like all forms of media, have the potential to convey and explore meaning and ideas, and doing this interactively means that we find these things out with the game rather than from the game. It's like learning something by yourself or being taught. The difference means all the world. Interactivity is one of the most powerful aspects of video games as a whole because it means that we can create meaning through play and interaction. Through clever design and meaningful mechanics, this isn't just the story of the mind of a man, but also a story about the nature of introspection, and it's told simply by letting us play through it. I kind of think the narrative is superfluous then because it characterizes the narrator, but aside from that it just grates more than it grinds. Of course, in the end, it's always going to be a story about a man coming to terms with himself and his life, but it would be so much more authentic to that experience if we found it out with him rather than finding it out from him. That's the point of introspection, to get through the fog and to find the way through uncertain terrain, getting a little closer to the truth with every step you take. What you do with that truth at the end of it? Well, that one's up to you.